everyone. I'm delighted that we're doing another hybrid show with in the room and people at home. My name is Carol DePodme. I'm the programs librarian here at Orcas Public Library. And we start all of our hybrid events with an apology. Because, and today especially with the addition of the microscope, we're pushing all kinds of technological limits, at least in my experience. So thank you in advance for your patience with any feedback. We'll punch on the mute as quickly as we can on all the right devices. For those of you in the room, we have restrooms in the lobby there if you need them. For those of you at home, you know where they are. Any questions, please use the chat window. For the folks that are in Zoom in the room, please raise your hands. And we are recording the event tonight. Thank you, Lynette, for letting us do that. And for the best experience at home, use speaker view and mute your microphone.
For you and me too.
I hear giggling in the background. Someone's having a good time. Let me admit a few more people. There we go. And let's see, things you should know from a program perspective. We'll be having drop-in chess on Sunday. It's possible Phil might have met his match. We'll see. There's someone who's quite a good player. Actually give Phil a run for his money, but we're not sure that Phil can make it yet. But also on Sunday is our monthly family game night, which starts at 5. And then on Sunday, the 27th, we have Katie Bowman from Squim coming. We're excited. She's a biomechanist. And she'll be doing a little presentation program and book signing out on the South Lawn. South Lawn for all of those on Zoom. And let's see, any other bits and bobs? We have recurring Tech Tuesdays at noon here at the library. If you need technical assistance, Orcas Online kindly donates their time. And we have an exciting April coming up. Stay tuned. Let's see, big thank you to Friends of the Library for all they do to help us do programming, and to all of you for coming. And to Lynette Wood and Lynette for making this happen tonight. They've been on the island 11 years, and Lynette was the the chair of the senior center, the Orcas Island Senior Center. And you're a volunteer, let me make sure I get this right, with the phytoplankton survey team. Excellent. If you have any questions about plankton, phytoplankton, all this stuff, she's your woman. I'm delighted that she was able to join us here tonight. So with that, I'm going to switch over to the camera where you will see Lynette. And off she'll go.
Hello, everyone. So you can hear me out there in Zoom land?
Well,
Yes, I'm hoping that's a yes.
Yeah, I think so. Let's see.
I have to talk louder. Okay.
And let's see. Another person can come in.
Yeah, there's some more people coming in the back.
Yeah. Sounds good. Great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. And those of you in the room, there's handouts that you can take home with you if you like. And there's also other stuff to look at, books and things, but please leave anything that's laminated, please leave it behind. Hello. Hello. Hi. You could, there's some chairs over here and here also. Okay.
Maybe there was some live plankton, so obviously.
Yeah,
There are.
Yes, there are.
They're great. Yeah, they're on the microscope.
Live plankton. So this is gonna be a technological challenge. I'm gonna give a talking presentation for about 40 minutes. Then I'm gonna give a 2-minute short little pretty picture presentation with music. And then I'm gonna have a live plankton through a microscope that hopefully will go out into Zoom land and you'll all be able to see it. And we also have a microscope over here so you can really get close and friendly with the plankton. So with that, I will start with the presentation. Now, let's see, the first thing I need to do is what?
Share. Go to the Zoom.
Share screen.
Yeah, so that's going to be in your Zoom window.
In my Zoom window.
There we go. And the desktop, that's fine. And then, is this the one with sound?
No.
Great. Just
Oh,
make
this
it-
is, it's already,
Yeah, there
okay,
you go.
that's, yeah,
Okay,
okay.
that's,
So is it, how's it looking out there in Zoom land?
it looks pretty good.
Looks okay? All right, okay, good. All right, so like plankton, life and death. Before I start, I want to introduce not just myself, but the 3 other plankton volunteers that work here on Orcas Island. Leslie Hutchinson and Lisa Poitras, neither of whom are in the room. County Dock, which is located off Madrona Point, and myself and Sheila Schittelbauer. We sample out at the Glenwood Springs Salmon Hatchery, Long Live the Kings Salmon Hatchery. So what are plankton? Oh, sorry, that's a ton of planks. Plankton are organisms that drift or float in the ocean. We usually think of them as small and microscopic, although anything that drifts or floats and cannot self-propel itself, such as jellyfish, are also technically plankton. But the small microscopic ones that we're used to thinking about consist of diatoms, protozoans, algae, small crustaceans, baby clams, and the eggs and larval stages of all kinds of larger animals. There's 2 main large categories of plankton. The first are phytoplankton, phyto, the Greek word meaning of plants or plants. So those are the plant plankton, and zooplankton, those are the animal plankton. By the way, the word plankton is plural. If you just have one, you have a plankter. Who knew, huh? Plankton are life-giving. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at what they used to call the food chain, and now they call the food web, you find plankton pretty close to the bottom of it. Shellfish and small fish feed on plankton. Larger fish feed on smaller fish. Mammals and humans, birds feed on fish. And so plankton are near the very bottom of the food chain, and the whole rest of the food chain or the food web upward depend on having a healthy plankton population. So in that way, plankton are life-giving. They're life-giving in another way too. If you take a deep breath, release it, half of the oxygen in that breath came from plankton, from marine plankton. The rest came from terrestrial plants and trees, but half came from plankton. So you have plankton to thank for that. Some of the tiniest things in the sea provide over half of the air's oxygen. Wow, it's hard to hug a phytoplankton, but wouldn't you like to? But not all plankton are good plankton. There's some plankton that carry toxins that if they get into shellfish and accumulate in shellfish and you eat them, they can cause quite a bit of sickness. There's one plankton called Dinophysis that we find pretty much every time we sample here. Not in huge quantities, but it's almost always there, that has a toxin that causes diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting. This is called diuretic shellfish poisoning, and it's caused by ochreic acid in the Dinophysis. A second one that we also find pretty frequently here in East Sound, is called Pseudonychia, and it carries a toxin called domoic acid, which causes things like short-term memory loss and difficulty breathing, and it's called amnesic shellfish poisoning. A third one that we also find here not quite as frequently, but we do find it, is called Alexandriarium, and that causes paralytic shellfish poisoning, which also causes nausea and vomiting. It can cause muscle weakness. It can actually paralyze you, and in that case, the respiratory distress is such that you stop breathing. And incoherent speech, because the larynx is a muscle, so you have difficulty speaking. All of these things can kill you in large enough quantities. They can definitely make you sick. And these are all 3 that we find here in the local waters, and then we monitor for here weekly in the spring and summer and every other week in the winter. And then the last one that I want to mention, because it's kind of interesting, we don't have it here, but they do have it along the East Coast, and that's called Carinia brevis, and it causes a neurotoxic shellfish poisoning that causes things like numbness, dizziness, slurred speech, and most interesting symptom is a reversal of hot-cold sensation. So if you put your hand on a block of ice, it feels hot. If you put your hand on a hot plate or a warm hot plate, it feels cold. So that's kind of interesting. There was a so-called record-setting red tide in Florida a couple of years ago that actually showed up as red. And it was caused by this particular plankton, Carinia brevis, and it caused a lot of fish to die and wash up on the shore. Now, before I continue, I want to say a little bit about the term red tide. Although this plankton did show up as red when it bloomed, normally these blooms are not red, and I'll show you some other blooms from the local East Sound in a minute, and you'll see that they're not always red. In fact, they're hardly ever red. So the other thing is they're not associated with tides. So the whole term red tide is wrong because it's not red usually, and it's not associated with tides. But what happens, I think the way they got named as a tide is because if any plankton that floats on the surface tends to get blown into shore and accumulate on the shore. And so people probably associated them with tides because of that. But nowadays we don't call them red tides anymore. We call them harmful algal blooms. You remember in the previous slide, I listed algae among the types of plankton. So all marine algae are plankton, not all plankton are algae. Okay, we did have our own record-setting toxic bloom here on the West Coast in 2015. Remember the blob in 2014, 2015? That was a big offshore, big blob of warm air that just hung around there for like a couple of years. Well, that resulted in this record-setting toxic bloom of Pseudonychia all up and down the coast. Again, you recall I said that Pseudonychia produces a neurotoxin called domoic acid, which causes amnesic shellfish poisoning in all mammals, not just humans. So why was it record-setting? Well, for one thing, it stretched all up and down the entire coast. For another thing, it started much earlier in the year than this species usually starts to bloom, months earlier. And it lasted a lot longer. Even though the bloom was in 2015, a lot of the shellfish, including crabs, retained the toxin in their bodies well into 2016. And there were still beaches closed in Washington and California in early 2016. So it was record-setting in its geographic extent, and it was record-setting in the time that it lasted. It was the first time in Washington state history that marine mammals were reported to be having seizures as a result of this toxin. And there's a picture of a seal having a seizure. Beaches were closed throughout the coast. There were public advisories, not just on shellfish, but on some kind of fish, for catching some kinds of fish. There were sea lion strandings, and there were up to 30 large whale mortalities that were suspected of being caused by this toxin in Alaska, plus there were possible bird mortalities. Yet, in that same year, almost 400,000 people harvested almost 6 million clams in Washington state. Mm-hmm. These are people on Long Beach harvesting clams. So how can that be? Well, it's because the Washington Department of Health monitors shellfish, and they take samples. Rosario Resort is one place where they take samples, and they send them off to Seattle, and they test them in a lab, and they find out if there's any toxin in there or not. And if there is, they close the beach, and they tell you not to harvest there. This is a map of San Juan County that I downloaded this morning, and you can see that pretty much all of it's green. that is open, except for East Sound. There's a whole lot of red in East Sound. And right now, East Sound is closed for, it says here in tiny little print, butter and varnish clams. Okay, so I think that must be leftover toxins from last year, because we haven't had a bloom here all winter. You don't get blooms in the winter. But butter clams in particular retain the toxin for months, even a year. So I think this must be from last year's blooms. So this is pretty good right now as far as recreational harvesting. But later in the year, it could easily, and has in the past, looked like this. Whole thing is red. Everything's red. And this was from 2018. And there was a big bloom, as I'll show you shortly, in 2018 that's just really negatively affected everything. So if you are somebody who does recreational harvesting, please look at this map before you catch stuff, and definitely look at it before you eat stuff. Yeah.
How does that impact the people that commercially grow?
Oh yeah, it definitely impacts them.
They're not able to
Absolutely.
sell
They can't sell it. I mean, they can't, they're not allowed to.
Mhm.
They have their own monitoring program, and they do a lot more monitoring, obviously. But I have a story later that'll feed into that question as well. The question was, how does that affect commercial harvesters? Okay, so back to the food web thing. We're looking at clams and other shellfish. We're looking at the Department of Health monitoring the flesh of shellfish to see if it's already contaminated. Wouldn't it be nice if we could monitor plankton and see if there's a bloom happening before it gets into the shellfish? Well, that's exactly what SoundToxins program is. It's a Puget Sound wide program that's funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that monitors toxic plankton in 35 sites throughout the Puget Sound. I already mentioned the 3 Dinophysis, Alexandriarium, and Pseudonychia that we monitor for as the toxins to human consumption. There's all kinds of volunteers who do that monitoring throughout the Sound. There's a partnership with other educational institutions, most importantly, the University of Washington and all the tribal governments. There's actually 27 partners right now. When the program first started, there were 6. The program first started in 2006 with 6 partners. And we started monitoring here on Orcas Island in 2012 at the county dock, in 2013 at the salmon hatchery. And we've continuously monitored at those 2 locations since then. Here are all the currently active monitoring sites in Puget Sound, and here are the sites in San Juan County. Notice that in 2000, there's 2 yellow dots there, one at Rosario and one at Dolphin Bay. And those sites were monitored briefly in 2012 and 2013, and then they weren't monitored anymore after that. There's a site down at the south end of Lopez that somebody thought they were going to monitor, but so there's a dot there. But if you look at the database, there's not been a single sampling taken from that site. So the only 2 sites in the entire county that have had continuous monitoring since 2012 are the 2 on Orcas Island. So how do we do it? Well, here we are out at the Glenwood Springs site, and Sheila Schettelbauer is in the back there. She came in like, she's the other plankton monitor. And so I don't know if those of you in Zoom land, if there's a little square with my picture in it, then you can see this is the net we use. So we carry out this net, and then it has this thing in it that captures the plankton. And this thing is calibrated. So depending on the length of how long you send this down into the water, you can calculate the volume that you took of water that is now concentrated in this, what they call the cod end. I have no idea why they call it that. And there's this mesh thing you can see here where the water pours out. And the mesh size of this particular net is 20 microns, which is 20 millionth of a meter. right? So any plankton that's 20 microns or larger will easily get captured by this. Any plankton that are smaller than 20 microns, which there are some, and I'm going to talk about them shortly, will not necessarily get captured by this. And there are some poisonous ones that don't get captured at all. And then so we take that sample, we put it in a jar, we take a bunch of other measurements. We take the salinity of the water with this salinity refractometer. We take the temperature of the water, and we record the tide, the weather, and a bunch of other things. And then we take the sample back to our homes. I would like to say the lab, but we don't. We take it back to our homes and we look at it through a microscope. And we can't, if there's toxic plankton in there, we have to count them, literally count them, and so that we can calculate the density of them. And then we record everything we see, whether it's toxic or not. We record everything we see and we put it in a database. So that's one of the former volunteers out there getting ready to put the net in. Okay, so I'll show you some pictures, more pictures in a second, but I do want to add that climate change is having an effect. And there are species of toxic plankton that are starting to show up in our local waters that until previously had not been here in large enough quantities to be worrisome. And they are starting to become worrisome. So SoundToxins in 2019 added 3 new species to our monitoring program. And they are the following. The first one is called Protoceration reticulatum. And it is actually regulated in the European Union. It's common enough in the European Union that they regulate it there, which means anything over a certain threshold of having that toxin is not considered safe to eat. It's now being found in blue mussels in the Puget Sound. So we're starting to monitor for that. The second one is called Ashishio sanguinea, and it produces kind of a slime that acts as a detergent on birds, and it takes the oil out of their feathers so they can no longer repel water, and then they become hypothermic because they can't repel water, and then they die. And there were 13,000 birds in 2009 that were killed by a bloom of this toxic plankton off the coast of Washington. And then the last one that we've been asked to monitor is called, now this one I'm not sure I can pronounce, Phaeocystis globosa. This produces really large macro colonies of this gelatinous foam. I mean, huge, massive, that they can be miles in width. And it collects on the surface of beaches and washes, or on the surface of the water, and can wash up on beaches. In 2001, one of these giant foam things killed about 10 million kilograms of mussels off the coast of Netherlands, and was also attributed to killing some people who were doing water sports in the foam. So if you see this on the beach, do not touch it, do not swim in it, and, just don't. So we're monitoring that now. So why is monitoring plankton important? Well, there's a number of reasons. The blooms themselves occur over a period of about a week to 10 days, and you can see the populations of the plankton growing until it becomes a bloom, and then it peaks out and then it starts to taper off again. So if you know that a bloom is coming or is there, but the shellfish haven't had time yet to accumulate it, the shellfish are still safe to eat. So you can say, okay, you can take the shellfish out now, take it out now, but don't take it out after Tuesday. And by the way, you can take twice as much as you normally would. In other words, get the shellfish out of the water while it's still safe, and then let it be until the bloom passes. So you can control the timing and the amount of shellfish that you are allowed to take out of the water, depending on that. And then also just don't swim in it. I mean, that's kind of obvious, but some of them are safe to swim in. I'll show you pictures shortly, but not always. Any questions? Because I feel like I'm forgetting something, yeah.
Someone on chat asks, isn't there an East Coast red tide that is not harmful to humans?
There could very well be. There absolutely could be.
Absolutely.
And probably, that's exactly right. So good question, because here's something you see almost every, the question, by the way, was, isn't there an East Coast red tide that's not toxic? And I think the answer is probably yes. And the reason I say that is because almost every year in the Bay and East Sound here, people will see this sort of kind of tomato soup. I've heard people call it tomato soup colored or rust colored bloom. And they always freak out. Oh my God, it's a toxic bloom. Every time I've gone down there and taken a sample and looked, it's not a toxic bloom. It's a bloom of Noctiluca, which is like it's like the plankton version of jellyfish. And that's what it looks like under a microscope. And it's a dinoflagellate that has a little tail. You can see the tail of this one curled around here. And it's perfectly safe to swim in this if you want. So that's, if next time you see that this year, probably, because it seems to come almost every year near the end of summer. It's tomato soup or rust colored. It's just probably Noctiluca. So that's East Sound. Here's another couple blooms that we saw. These are toxic blooms in 2016 and 2017. This was the same that caused the one I showed before from 2015. This Pseudonychia is these little sticks that they're tiny. I don't know if you can see, but they're like this, but then they line themselves up in these long sticks, which really clog up the net, I can tell you. And this sample jar here on the left, that is not silt, that's not sediment, that is Pseudonychia. And it was horrible, it was disgusting. I mean, you could smell it coming down the road onto the beach. You could smell it from a distance, it was just horrible. And that's the one you recall that causes amnesic shellfish poisoning. Okay, and then Heterosigma. Now I haven't mentioned this yet, but because this doesn't harm humans, but it does harm fish, particularly salmon, which is why we monitor it at the salmon hatchery. This is a picture of the salmon harvest in 2018. And in that year, we had a bloom of Heterosigma. And this is what it looks like. That, again, that's not silt, that is not, that's not runoff coming out of the fish. That's where the fish go up to the ladder, the fish ladder. That is Heterosigma. And it's kind of, I would call it ochre colored. Is that how you pronounce it? Ochre? I would call it that. Brownish, kind of a yellowish brown color. And it was also in Rosario at the same time. And again, that one smelled bad too. I mean, just, it was horrible. This is a close-up of the sample jar. Now, you may wonder, why is the sample jar so clear, relatively speaking, compared to that previous one, the Pseudonychia one, when it's blooming in the water, it looks as horrible as it does. The reason is Heterosigma, which looks like this, is only about 10 to 15 microns in width. Remember, the net is 20 microns. So most of it just escaped right through the net. So we only captured a fraction of what was actually there. And you never see it like this in the microscope. Normally you see one or two zipping by now and then. You just don't see it in mass quantities like this. It's the only time I've ever seen this. And then another, now I probably really can't see this with another blurry picture, but another really interesting characteristic of Heterosigma that's very diagnostic for identifying it with certainty is these streaks that it forms down the jar here. Very characteristic. Put it out in the sun and after about 20 minutes or half an hour, it'll start to form those streaks. And I actually saw this once when we were out kayaking in Deer Harbor. I saw a bunch of those streaks going down in the water. Okay, so I have just a couple more slides, and I have a brief pretty picture thing, and then we'll look at the microscope, and then we'll have questions, and then we'll look at the microscope. But I did want to say a few things about climate change, because I always get asked this: what's the impact of climate change on plankton? Probably not good, but the one thing I've really appreciated and learned in years of doing this is how incredibly dynamic the plankton population is. I mean, you go there one week and something's blooming. You go there the next and that thing's completely gone and something else is blooming. You go there the third time and there's nothing blooming, but there's, 24 different species all happily living together. And then you go back and there's two things blooming. And it's incredibly dynamic. And all these little guys are competing with each other. Some of them favor more saline water, higher salinity. Some favor less. Some like warmer water. Some like less warm water. And then the wind can blow them in from offshore. So they're always competing, and the environment's constantly changing. If you have a rainstorm, there's a lot of fresh water that reduces the salinity. So it's really hard to say exactly species by species how it's going to affect plankton. However, having said that, what you can say is that certain species of plankton, like the dinoflagellates that can move and get out of the way and go to cooler water or go to more saline water or whatever, will probably be better off than the ones that can't move. That's one thing you can probably say. There have been people who study this for a living and have been at it for decades, have noticed that there has been an increase in the frequency and the toxicity of harmful algal blooms since the 1980s. And so naturally, we can expect that at best we can say there's going to be a major shift of the plankton ecosystem, and it's not clear how that's going to impact animals up the food chain. It's likely to not have a good effect on them, but it's really hard to say. And then of course there's ocean acidification too, and that anything that's made of calcium is going to be harmed. And it turns out there's some recent studies that show that anything made of silica, like diatoms, are also going to have problems with ocean acidification. So here's some resources you can look at. Here's some pretty pictures. The one right in the middle is the Pseudonychia that really shows how those little individual sticks line up to make long sticks. And then with any luck, we're going to do a short 2-minute presentation with pretty pictures, and then we'll have questions. And then we can look at the, or if you want to look at the microscope first.
So I'm going to mute.
Okay, so yeah, we have to,
right?
Yeah, and
you're going to share with sound.
And I'm going to unmute. All right, there you go. Uh-oh, feedback. Okay.
Will you search through the lonely earth through the briar and bramble. I'll be your treasure. I felt the touch of the kings and the breath of the wind. I need the call of all the songbirds. They sang all the wrong words. I'm waiting for you. I'm waiting for you. Will you swim through the briny sea for me, roll along the ocean's floor? I'll be your treasure. I'm with the ghosts of the men who can never sing again. There's a place, follow me, where a love lost at sea is waiting for you, is waiting for you.
Thank you. No, I just want to. Okay, so now shall we try the microscope? So far, so good.
Do you live right Willie?
Huh? Oh, what?
Do you live right Willie?
Isn't that diddlem?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. So can we see that? Okay, so
Let's see,
yeah, so we have a microscope here. Can they hear me? There's a, oh, this is nice. Okay, look, we have a Carcinodiscus, but see the thing that looks like two discs, two lines between them? That's a Carcinodiscus on the side. It's actually like a hockey puck. It's shaped like a hockey puck, and you usually only see it from the top down, so it just looks like a circle. But that's nice because you can see that one from the side.
And these are all ones that you, Ken, went and got
Yeah, just-
early, moments before the presentation.
Oh, here's some nice, these are nice Catosauras. Oh, there's a, oh, shoot, there it goes.
Oh,
What is that?
Polychaete.
Polychaete, no. I'm not sure what that is. Looks like a little,
So
what the heck is that? See what I mean? Isn't this cool? And that, this one here with a bunch of things in a row, that's a Thalassiosira. Oh, and there's a nice Protoperidinium. This is a wonderful sample. Look at all this stuff. There's a nice, what is this one?
Catastrophes.
You think that's a
Where your
Catosauras?
arrow is.
Really?
Yeah.
That could be.
The big
All those
chain.
chains.
Yeah.
All those. That's the most abundant diatom, Catastrophes genus.
Yeah, isn't this great? Look at that stuff. Good sample, Ken.
Where's the sample from?
And along with the kings, you know, we actually got.
Oh, there's a,
We're trying to get one at West.
Astronella.
yeah.
We're in between the two Cosmodiscus.
Or Thalassionema.
Can you use your cursor to point to things and say what they are? There we go.
Yeah,
Right there.
Thalassionema.
Another big
Oh,
one.
yeah. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, that's okay, yeah. These giant blobs, Let me see if I can get, oh, look at that, there's a big copepod.
What's a copepod?
It's a zooplankton.
Okay.
I don't know the zooplankton very well at all. That's gigantic, it's a monster. Yeah, it's huge. Anyway, so these,
Right there, socialis.
yeah.
You're almost
right,
there.
I know, I'm trying, oh, there's a stick, okay, we got two things going on here. Hold on, whoop,
That's a good estimate.
yeah, it is a good one.
Ooh, Alexandriarium.
This is the stick here is a Pseudonychia, the one we've been talking about, the toxic one that gives you amnesic shellfish poisoning. Now, I was trying to find that.
Socialis.
Yeah, I know, but.
Lower right, isn't it? No. There you
Okay,
go.
there we
it
go.
is. Looks like pearls.
Yeah. Okay. But the problem is up is down and left is right. So, okay, well, anyway, I'm gonna quit doing that. I'm gonna try to, this blobby thing here is called Catastrophes socialis, social catastrophes. And that's a tintinid, that one moving around there. And this is the round circles, the cosynodiscus, that's what it normally looks like, just a round circle. But it's actually more like a hockey puck.
The ones not moving dead.
No, they're phytoplankton, they're just plants.
They might be.
Although,
pinned down.
yeah, they might be pinned down too, that's the other thing, yeah.
Come down.
With the cover slip. Do you have a cover slip on there? Yeah, so they might be
Slide
smashed.
itself. Gotcha.
Yeah,
But those are the plants. That's our-
yeah,
Okay.
And then those other ones are the animals.
So
It's all
phytoplankton, so the animals. Can't believe I hit 60 without knowing that.
Because.
well, interesting.
They make total sense.
Interestingly, there are some that are called mixotropes, and they can photosynthesize, and they can graze, and they'll switch between the two depending on the conditions. And one of them is the Dinophysis, and that's one of the toxic ones. It can switch between being a photosynthesizer or a grazer.
Yeah, the dinoflagellates.
Yeah,
It can change
It
between
can
a
be
plant or an
both.
animal.
kind of,
It
yeah.
doesn't change really, it just does both.
Does both, yeah.
Wow.
It's called a
It can
mixotrope.
create its own.
There's, oh, this, here we go.
And eat other things.
Here's the Catastrophes socialis again.
That's a
That's
nice
a
one.
really good image of that.
Does that mean it can decide what it wants to be when it grows up?
So anyway, this is a good sample.
That's real good one.
Yeah, really good sample.
So what causes the toxins to dissipate or disappear?
Well, the toxins is a good question. The question was what causes the toxins to disappear? The toxins are always there. It's just that you usually don't have a bloom of the plankton that has the toxin in it. So the toxin's always there. In fact, it's interesting why are some plankton toxic? It might be a good question also. I think that might be a Heterosigma right there. The little dot. The little dot in the middle flitting around may be a Heterosigma. Why are the standard reason anything is toxic is in nature is like the keep away from me. But interestingly, with Pseudonychia, the toxin, the domoic acid, actually helps it in the photosynthesis process. It helps it uptake iron, which helps it photosynthesize. Is the word. So, and it's likely that the other toxins in the other species have some function like that too. We just don't know what it is yet. Yeah. Another good question that somebody asked me last time, I thought, was, why don't the shellfish get sick? And in fact, they do. If you take butter clams from Alaska that have not been exposed to the toxins here in the Puget Sound and put them in the Puget Sound, they will get sick. The reason is the butter clams here have mutated, and they have they have an enzyme that protects them from the toxin that the ones in Alaska, the same species of clam in Alaska, don't have. So, yeah. What other questions are in the chat?
Let's see. We are current with questions. Anybody online, if you have a question, please pop it in the chat. I think you could also unmute and ask your question. I think we can make that work too.
So Lynette, when you say you calculate and you count when you're trying to calculate a bloom, your net, you can calculate volume of water that you've strained, essentially, or netted for plankton based on how deep you go.
Right.
And then, so when you prepare a slide, you're taking a measured amount of water.
Yep.
And then you have to physically count specifically on a slide.
Right.
So you have to be pretty methodical. You're doing it in some kind of grid pattern. And then from there, you can make a calculation based on that volume of water and so how do you know when there's a bloom?
Well,
You just know
yeah.
from previous samples or historically
There-
that you would typically have X amount of something?
Right, so it's a good question. The question is, how do you know when you have a bloom? In case those of you in Zoom land didn't hear the question. The microscope, this is not the slide we use for the test. The slide we use is a calibrated, like you've inferred to be an exact thing, an exact amount. And the actual slide, just the slide, to replace that slide, if it ever gets broken, would cost about $430 just for that slide.
Gotcha.
So you're right. Everything you've inferred is absolutely correct. Everything's calibrated. And so there's just a formula that then, after you meticulously count all of them, you just plug it into the formula and come out with the amount per volume. Now, the question is, how do you know when it's a bloom? What they've asked us to do is they've defined bloom to be, it's kind of a combination. It's a little bit subjective, and it's kind of a combination on a whole lot and being the majority species in the sample. Okay, so it's a little, that's why I say a little bit subjective, because some people might, based on their own experience, might make that subjective cutoff a little bit different than others. And we've got a number of categories that we put. We've got absent, present, common, and bloom. And they used to have a fifth category called abundant between common and bloom. And I really miss that one because I often would have something that I felt was abundant. It was more than common, it was abundant, but I wouldn't have called it a bloom yet. But now they want you to call it a bloom. So, yeah.
Is there an assumption made on the plankton that are 10 to 15 microns that you assume a certain amount escape sampling?
Yeah.
And then because obviously if to come up with a bloom of something that can get through your 20 micron net means that there's a certain assumed loss, right?
Right.
Is that part of the calculation?
Yeah, not all, that it's somewhat correct what you just said. Not all the things we count are in what they call the net toe for exactly that reason. The Pseudonychia, in fact, we're supposed to count that in what's called the whole water sample, which we just take from skimming whole water off the surface without concentrating it. And this all has to do, each species kind of gets processed a little differently. And it has to do with how much you actually need of that species, that density that you need in the water to actually make it toxic and dangerous. So that's why the methodology is a little bit different depending on what you look at. So we have to systematically sit there and count Dinophysis. We have to count Alexandriarium. And in the net toe sample, we have to count Pseudonychia, but in the whole water sample, thank God, because counting it in that net toe would be a nightmare, and which I didn't even know for the first couple of years, and I was counting like tens of thousands of Pseudonychia. And then the Heterosigma, because you saw what that's like, it's just tiny, and they zip around, you can't count them unless you kill them. That's the only way you can count them, is kill them first, because they just move too fast. So we look at the whole water sample for the Heterosigma as well. And then we count the 3 new ones that we're supposed to monitor. We have to count those. Yeah.
Someone asks, if Pseudonychia is the false Nychia, what is the true Nychia? And what does it do?
I think I know the person who asked that question.
Fun.
Yeah,
So after you're done with your sample, can you then just go put it back in the ocean?
we used to do that. That's what we should do, put the biomass back in the ocean. I don't always do it.
Right.
By the way, kids want to look through that microscope, they can see the little guys moving around in here as well.
Yeah. And then Lynette,
You can move the slide back and forth.
I can get a stool. Someone asked how many times you collect.
How many times do we collect?
How many times
How
a year do you
frequently?
typically sample?
Right, okay, so the question is, how many times do we collect? We collect every week from March through October, and every other week, November through February. So I don't know how many times that is. But you did remind me with that question of something else that I looked up just because I was kind of curious. A lot of things bloom, not just toxic plankton, but non-toxic plankton bloom. So I looked back at my historical record of what I'd entered for the last 3 years, 2019, 2020, and 2021. And I recorded in that 3 years 22 separate blooms. 6 of them were of species toxic to humans. And the rest were either not toxic to humans or they were not toxic at all. So that gives you an idea just of,
Mostly they are not.
mostly they're not toxic. Yeah, most of the blooms are not toxic. Yeah.
No more questions.
Maybe
Oh, here's a question in the room.
I missed this at the beginning, but a bloom, is that like flowers that go into bloom, like they're
No,
reproduced? Or-
it's just a lot.
It's just abundance.
It just
An
means abundance.
They reproduce.
Yeah,
in mass.
Yeah, but you have reminded me of another interesting factoid about Alexandriarium, which is one of the toxic ones. Alexandriarium does create cysts, and the cysts go into the sediment, and they can stay there for years, even decades. And so you may not think you have a problem. In fact, the first probably 6 years that I monitored out here, I never saw Alexandriarium, ever. And then all of a sudden it started showing up. So it can just stay there dormant and they can all bloom at once. And that's why you have to keep looking for it. Even though you don't see it, doesn't mean it's not there. It just may be dormant.
It just needs the right conditions.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. It just needs the right conditions.
They're storms.
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah, storm, yeah, it could be anything.
2 more comments from Zoom land. Margot says, this makes me excited seeing these all over again, Lynette.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for an informed talk.
Margot, by the way, Margot launched the Orcas phytoplankton team. She was the first phytoplankton volunteer on Orcas Island.
Lovely.
So-
And then, sorry.
Yep.
One more to say about Margot. Sounds super. And then Lisa says, the counting process seems like a good opportunity to apply machine learning
Yeah.
and AI. The
Yeah.
counting, is there technical innovation taking place?
Yeah.
You're aware of?
Well, not that I'm aware, because volunteers are cheap. There are a lot of technologies that could be used, but they all cost money, and volunteers are very, very cheap. Seriously.
Any other questions in the room or?
So is your calibrated slide then just is that a focused view? Do you have to move the slide around to count still?
Yeah. Yeah,
So
it's a pain in the butt.
how do you keep track? Does the calibrated slide have some kind of X, Y?
It doesn't. There is such a thing. Ours don't have that because we have to have a calibrated volume. And the ones that have that grid don't seem to have that calibrated volume. It seems to be one or the other. On the East Coast, they use the other kind, the kind with the grid. I don't know why. But anyway, no, we just kind of keep track of where we're at and do our best. I mean, if it's a natural bloom, you're looking at a lot, and the 10% error is not going to matter that much, really. Yeah, yeah.
Just as you were scrolling around trying to find fun stuff, I was thinking, how do you not get lost?
Oh yeah, no. Oh, well, I don't use, first of all, I don't use this microscope. Yeah, I use that one because it's got a table that goes very systematically.
Oh, okay.
Like back and
So the
forth,
table itself has a.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, actually.
Once you back a couple of times, you orient yourself.
Here's another,
Yes, I've never done that, but yeah, I've done something very similar, yeah.
any other questions? What's this giant thing here?
It's, as you go from Parkland or South of California, it's maybe 4 miles. And it's down, there's down to the beach.
There's a lot of stuff in this sample.
Is it at any time or set hour?
No, I mean, it's on.
What's the one that looks like train tracks?
That's the upper level, that's the Thalicio Syra, Syra.
I know.
Thalicio Syra.
And that's different from the bracelet that's going
It's
this
long
way.
like the kings.
Right. Exactly. So, this is, what's that?
I don't remember, I have to look it up. Yeah.
Well, when you go to the.
Gee whiz. We're talking about like 3 drops of water.
Yeah, I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
Yes, totally.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, the design.
Yeah.
Let them float. Increase the surface area, so they can float, not just sink to the bottom.
So how
They
does,
need to photosynthesize.
so how do these algal blooms or blooms, I don't know if that's the correct term, compare with ponds that are freshwater?
Yeah, they have the diatoms too.
Yeah, and they have blooms also.
So while this is happening, I have 2 questions we ask near the end of all of our programs. I've put it in the chat window for the folks in Zoom. First is, how did you hear about the program? Second is, would you recommend it to a friend? So how did you guys hear about the program?
The poster.
The one at the library.
Orcas issues.
Orcas issues. Yeah, this is, I mean, it's. Okay, gotcha. Old habits. Gotcha. And would you recommend it to a friend? Yes.
Anyway, so that's pretty cool.
That's good.
Yeah.
I love the scenic photos.
Makes it sound like there's always issues,
Yeah.
which there always are.
They can change the street name before, but I still be calling it that 10 years ago. Oh, no, I just, this day, it might be I get to hear just hear this sound. Teach my kids and I just get school kids.
What's that?
What's that? Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. It could be just decomposing. Yeah. Question is, what's this thing right here?
That's what I mean.
Yeah, I think it could be just something decomposing.
The round one?
This is
That's
a,
a compliment discus too, that.
you think it's decomposing though?
When they
Yeah.
start getting, well, especially in fresh water or something, they just like it explode.
Oh, it's horrible. If you put drop of fresh water in with this plankton, it's horrible. Yeah,
They explode or did?
it kills them. I mean,
It just-
It's
and
a
they
salinity in that.
yeah,
Wow.
it's really bad. This is it's badly decomposed. It's just probably a skeleton. It's all that's left, but that's Heterosigma. That one right there.
Margot says, AI counting, I think the images in the microscope are too randomly presented, as well as needing depth focusing constantly. Why not leave it up why not leave it up to the enthusiastic volunteers?
Yeah. This thing here, just going back and forth, all these V's, that's Pseudonychia. And this one right here next to it with the little feet, that's a Protopteridinium. They're kind of cute. Sometimes they're really pink too, bright pink for some reason.
That's a silver flagellate right there.
The kind of.
Right above the Cosmodiscus.
Oh, yeah.
It's not
Oh, there's a
supposed to
Dinophysis. There's a Dinophysis right here. This is the one that I said was a mixotrope. You could either do photosynthesis or graze. And that's a Dinophysis. That's one of the toxic ones.
The little guy with the
This-
pointy?
The little guy right
Okay,
here.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Now the
okay.
question is, which Dinophysis is it, Sheila? It's either Norvegica or what's the other one? Acuminata?
Yeah. I can know that for sure.
Oh, I'm supposed to take a poll.
Yes.
Other.
Also.
Oh, absolutely.
You can mark them all, right? All three.
But anyway, that's a really nice Dinophysis.
Above the group, you could.
And then.
How many people are on the-
Oh, 14.
Tell them raise their hand. 1, 2, 3. How many people did this?
You know, it depends on how.
The votes was really good though, you know.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Polls out here.
Is that? It's wonderful.
Microphone, they're all here.
So it's re-up the.
I was, yeah, they must have, yeah.
And that funding is just for sort of infrastructure since.
And
I think we have one more question.
Supplies.
One more question,
All those
Lauren.
types of things.
There we go. Go ahead.
So, no more questions.
I'm gonna ask you actually one, just a second, please, you have a question or?
No.
No? Oh, she was just worried about people in Zoom during all the talking, so I'm sorry. So she was a library to do with. Carry on. So for everyone in Zoom, if there aren't any more questions, I think we'll go ahead and tie it up, put a bow around it and say, thank you all for attending. And if you have any other ideas for programs, please let me know. My email is on the website, and I'm Carol Plodney. And this has been super, Lynette. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.